Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author, professor, and ACLU president Deborah Archer with us today. We'll chat with Deborah in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Deborah Archer is a tenured professor and associate dean at New York University School of Law. She is also the president of the ACLU and a nationally recognized expert on civil liberties, civil rights, and racial justice. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute, and an award-winning teacher and legal scholar. Before full-time teaching, she worked as an attorney with the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Incorporated, where she litigated voting rights, employment discrimination, and school desegregation. She previously served as chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, the nation's oldest and largest police oversight agency. Deborah is the author of the new book, Dividing Lines: How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. Deborah, welcome into the back room.
Thank you for having me.
So congratulations on the book. It's called Dividing Lines: How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. Not only do I think this is a terribly important subject, but it's not one that I think a lot of people think about when they discuss racism and institutional racism in this country. What was it about this particular subject that moved you to write this book, and in particular at this moment in time?
Yeah, good questions to start with. Thank you. So I think you're not alone. A lot of folks, when they think about transportation, don't think about transportation in the way that I do, but you can't separate, I think, the story of American racism and the story of transportation in America, because they're deeply intertwined. Racism is about place on multiple levels. And one of the best ways to keep people in their place socially is to keep them in their place physically. And we've seen transportation infrastructure used in that way. And people often think about transportation as just something that moves people from A to B, but it really is the foundation of everything that we find valuable and important in our communities. It's the foundation of democracy, of good health, of access to economic opportunity and high quality education. And I came to understand that more as a civil rights advocate when I worked with a community in Syracuse, New York, that was fighting a transportation infrastructure project that threatened to destroy a community that it had originally, this highway had originally, impacted and destroyed this community 50 years ago. And now they were facing a redevelopment project that threatened to harm them again. And they wanted to make sure that racial justice and civil rights were at the center of the redevelopment efforts. And I was proud to be able to work with them, but then realized that this was a story, a history that repeated all across the country.
And you write in the book, quote, "In the history of the United States, transportation infrastructure is and always has been a political act. It also has been used to further white supremacy." Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I think transportation in America is a bit of a paradox because we often think of roads, highways, and public transit as symbols of progress and connection. And they absolutely, they are those things. But the story I tell in Dividing Lines is about how these same systems have also been used as tools of exclusion and displacement, especially in Black communities. So as legal segregation began to crumble during the civil rights movement, cities across America started turning to infrastructure, highways and roads and public transit systems as a more permanent and more visible way to enforce racial hierarchy, because we were losing the invisible tools like redlining, racial covenants, and racial zoning laws. And so they were turning to physical, actual lines to help reinforce that. And so in many ways, infrastructure replaced Jim Crow. Highways were deliberately routed through Black neighborhoods to destroy or divide them. City planners used things like one-way streets and dead ends and literal segregation walls to physically and socially isolate Black communities. And then public transit evolved under a cloud of racism. It moved from early explicit racial discrimination to more subtle dog whistle policies. And the result has been transportation deserts in Black communities from disinvestment but also in many white communities by design to keep Black people and other people of color out.
It's kind of shocking that this was a deliberate campaign.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think in part it tells the story of racism. Racism's power, in part, rests on its ability to adapt and evolve and to find its way into the spaces and the tools that we leave for them for it. And so I think Dividing Lines tells the story of how racism didn't just survive the fall of Jim Crow. It evolved and found new tools and zoning boards and city planning departments and federal transportation funding. What surprised me a little bit was how um, explicit some of the connections were that the city councils and mayors, city planning officials uh, don't always hide and didn't always hide their intention to use our transportation infrastructure as a tool of racial segregation and racial inequality. And so they didn't feel the need to hide that they were making that connection. And they were really smart about it because what they wanted and what they planned for came true. Because today, a lot of these pieces of infrastructure still stand, and we can see the impact that they've had on both locking in segregation, but also undermining the strength, health, and vitality of so many communities of color by isolating them and serving as a wall, both a physical and psychological wall and barrier.
Explain the transformational impact of the Federal Aid Highways Act of
Oh,
1956.
yeah. So that was one of the tools that folks used in the post-Jim Crow era. And in the book, I talk about the connection that it has to Brown versus Board of Education. So many people will remember that Brown versus Board of Education was a Supreme Court case decided in 1954 that said separate education facilities by race is unconstitutional. And Brown was important because it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which had said that separate could be equal. And that meant that the foundation of legalized racial separation and segregation was falling. And around the country, after that 1954 decision, we saw people recommit to segregation and say they're going to use every tool imaginable. And for years, we saw what was called massive resistance for 2 years. In 1956, that came to a head when over 100 federal legislators signed something called the Southern Manifesto, saying that they were going to use everything that they could to lock in segregation. 2 months after they signed that Southern Manifesto, we passed the Interstate Highway Act. And rather than build the Interstate Highway Act against the backdrop of Brown's promise to bring us all together and end segregation, instead, in many places, it was built against that resistance, right? Kind of embracing that resistance. One of the examples I talk about is Birmingham, Alabama. And Birmingham, which was known as Bombingham at that point in our history, had used every tool from legal segregation to violence to keep Black folks from integrating into white communities. And one of the primary tools they used was racial zoning laws. And racial zoning laws said that white folks could live in this particular zone, Black folks could live over here in this zone, and you can't live in a zone not designated for your race. That was also struck down in the 50s. And Birmingham then turned to the Interstate Highway Act and built the interstate highways on some of the exact same boundaries that we saw under racial zoning and locked in that segregation and that inequality that had existed and kept communities separate. Similarly, in Atlanta, they had racial zoning laws and built I-20 on some of the same boundaries that we saw implemented through the racial zoning law. And at one point, community members had gone to the mayor and said, we need to shift some of this. It doesn't even make sense from a transportation perspective. And he replied and said, no, we can't shift any of the route for I-20 because I promised the white community that I would use this to protect them from Black migration. So the boundaries have to stay as they are. So it is a deep part of our history that certainly the highways that were facilitated by the Interstate Highway Act have been phenomenal in connecting far-flung communities, in being an engine of economic opportunity and growth for this country, but it really also has this history of division and oppression in communities of color.
So we were talking about the Supreme Court. You mentioned Brown, but have there been court cases that really demonstrate the high court's complicity in this racial inequality and discrimination?
Yeah. So the book talks about the many ways that we have rendered powerful civil rights laws powerless to do this work because of the way the courts have interpreted and applied um, those civil rights laws in the context of infrastructure projects. And they do it in a way that kind of focuses on intent and a model of intent that ignores all the actual evidence of intent. So I talk a little bit about the way that I-40 was built in Nashville. And the court had before it so much evidence that it was intentionally designed to destroy a Black community. It got rid of hundreds of Black homes, 128 Black-owned businesses, 6 Black churches, really destroyed that community. And they lied to the Black community about where the highway was going. They lied about the day of the hearing where the Black community could come and voice their concerns. And the court still found no evidence of intentional discrimination. And another case that I talk about that I think really kind of shows some of the challenges in using the courts as a tool here is Memphis versus Green. And in Memphis, there were 2 communities neighboring each other, a Black community and a white community. And folks in the Black community would have to drive through the white community to access a park that was on the other side or to get to downtown. And the white community decided that they just didn't want Black folks driving through their community anymore. And they petitioned their local government to erect a barrier, a wall in the middle of the street that connected that Black community and the white community. And that case went to the Supreme Court. The majority of the court said, first, that the location of the wall didn't have anything to do with their race. It had to do with where they lived. And the court ignored the fact that where we live and our race are deeply entwined in this country. And the court also said that it was just a minor inconvenience, that folks in the Black community could still get to where they needed to go. They would just have to drive around and would add 10, 15 minutes to their travel, but it was fine because they could get to where they needed to be. Luckily, Thurgood Marshall was on the court at the time, and he really articulated some of what was really going on. He called out all of the justifications for building this wall, justifications around safety and concerns for unwanted elements as disguises for racial discrimination, real dog whistles. And he also said it wasn't about the inconvenience. It wasn't about the 15-minute extra commute. It was about your government sending a message to you that you are unwanted. And that's the message that was sent to the Black community, and your government sending a message to the white community that they're more valuable, that their lives and their wishes take precedence. It's about the government stamping you with another badge of inferiority. And we see that repeated around the country in the way that not just the highways were built, but the way that we have built and laid out our streets and street grids, and the way that we build public transportation. The book even talks about the way that it's embedded in pedestrian infrastructure.
No one would argue that this type of racial inequity and discrimination continues to this day, not just in the subjects we're talking about, but every day of Trump 2.0, we see that. How can federal, state, and or local governments deal with this transportation infrastructure system in particular to continue remedying that specific problem?
Yeah, and you make a great point in connecting it to some of the challenges that we're facing today, because today we can see a push to ignore the full extent of our history, to not want to have conversations about how we got here and what needs to be done to get us to a better place. We don't want to have conversations about the way we need to address and engage with racial discrimination and racial inequality, and keep those matters central as we move forward to build back better, right? Because we're going to build back better for everyone. We have to think about the things we've done to divide and separate, the things we've done to make some communities less hospitable than others, the way that we have built transportation infrastructure to force Black and Brown communities to host most of the negatives, right? The reduction in air quality and hazardous walking conditions and increased noise and more flooding, decreased property values, but don't allow them to enjoy a lot of the benefits. So I think at the federal, state, and local level, we really need to shift. And I don't know if you call it a community equity focus, an anti-racist focus, equitable design, but we need to do this in a way, plan our transportation infrastructure in a way that doesn't see our current landscape as a neutral baseline, that focuses on distributive equality, making sure that all communities get to enjoy the benefits of the infrastructure, but also host their fair share of the burdens. And we need a process that not only centers racial justice and racial equity, but requires that we see that in our outcomes as well. And on a day-to-day basis, I think for everyday folks, that means getting involved, getting engaged. These transportation infrastructure decisions are getting decided and discussed every day in communities around the country. And we need to be a part of that conversation to ask questions about the impact, the equitable impact of the decisions that are being made, and to make sure that this history doesn't get repeated as we move into modernizing our transportation infrastructure.
You end the book with the chapter called "The Goal is Justice," and in it you discuss the subject of reparations. Can you speak to that, and in particular, Portland, Oregon's preference policy?
Yeah, talking about the goal is justice came from a conversation I had with a community organizer in Indianapolis named Paula, who has been working around transportation infrastructure projects in Indianapolis. One had originally destroyed, deeply impacted the community she grew up in, and now they were facing a new infrastructure project. And for her, justice meant a lot of things, but the goal, defining justice for her community, meant building a community where people wanted to live, where people wanted to come back to, where everyone could be healthy and thrive and live choice-filled lives, and where the people who had been harmed and impacted decades before, that they and their family and their friends could come back to a community that they had been pushed out of or deprived access to. And so one of the ways that we're seeing around the country communities address this is something like the program in Portland, where they were focusing on a community where folks had been involuntarily displaced because of infrastructure projects, both transportation infrastructure projects, but also building a hospital and building other community facilities. And those kinds of infrastructure projects had disproportionately impacted Black and Brown folks. And so they're supporting those people who had been displaced and lost their homes and lost their communities, lost their sense of connection, helping them to come back to the community that used to be their home, and providing a host of resources and support in order to do that. Support with rent and locating housing, support with purchasing homes. And I don't argue that the Portland project initiative is perfect, but I do think that they're thinking creatively and expansively about how we make amends for what happened and what is continuing to happen in these communities, and how we can move forward in a way where we're all moving forward together.
The word reparations makes some white folks lose their minds.
Yes, absolutely. Tried not to say the word just now, and now you're going to bring me back and have me say it. But yeah.
So what do you say to them?
I think for me, it is not the word is not what's important. It is the idea that we should correct the problems that we've created. It is the idea that we took things from people unjustly, discriminatorily. And as a country, as a society, we should want to make that better and want to make amends for that. when people say reparations, some people automatically think about cash payments to people who they think don't deserve the financial support. Reparations can mean a whole host of things. And I think we should explore the full range of what reparations means. But also, people need to recognize that the folks today are bearing harms from the policies, practices, and actions of the past. There was no clear cutoff where we said, okay, racial discrimination is done. Everyone moving forward now is fine. We've corrected all those wrongs. We've never done that. It's just not true. And the communities that we're seeing today that, we are so easy to talk about bad and good communities and ignore the things that we have done to make those communities, quote unquote, bad, to deprive them of access to resources and opportunities, to keep them segregated, to keep them isolated. And we did that. We are continuing to do that. There was no clear cutoff where we fixed all the problems and made everything better and said, all the history of racism has now been erased. It is not that simple. And reparations is what we need in order to correct some of the wrongs, and full justice can really never be achieved because we're never going to get people back to where they could have been had we not taken their homes, right, to build a highway, had we not denied them access to the mortgages that we gave to some communities in the way that we did with redlining, had we given children equal access to educational opportunity. It's really impossible for us to erase that. But I think we have an obligation to do the best that we can to continue to try to address that.
So in our final few minutes here, let's talk about the current political landscape. From a legal/constitutional standpoint, what are your biggest concerns about Trump 2.0's actions these first 4 months? And how is the ACLU addressing them?
Yeah. We are certainly very concerned. I think this administration is clearly trying to shut down any power center that might hold the president accountable, right? We're talking about universities, a free press, the legal profession. I think this administration is targeting the most vulnerable communities, showing a real disrespect for the rule of law, for constitutional principles, for things that have been foundational to this country. Threatening our immigration system, undermining the First Amendment, focusing on deepening harm to racial minorities. And so the ACLU really did take seriously last year during the election everything that Donald Trump said he would do if he was elected into office. We took seriously all of the promises that were made in Project 2025. And that meant that we had a blueprint and we were ready to move forward and fight in this moment that we're in. And we know success in this moment isn't just about wins or losses. It's about showing up and fighting for our values, who we are as a country. Is about continuing to force this country to live up to the promises that it has made in our Constitution and our federal laws. It's about holding the line, delaying harm, diluting bad policies, and still making progress to deepen the protection of civil rights and civil liberties whenever and wherever we can. And so far, we have filed over 50 new legal cases against this administration, really covering the waterfront of civil rights and civil liberties issues. Folks have heard a lot about our work on in the area of immigration, around the Alien Enemies Act and expedited removal. We have filed a challenge to the attempts to get rid of birthright citizenship. We filed a challenge to efforts that this administration has taken to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations in schools in K through 12. We've challenged this administration's efforts to reverse our progress on trans justice, including their efforts to ban accurate gender markers on passports or to allow folks to access gender affirming care. We have really leaned into the First Amendment and protecting the First Amendment and representing dissidents who are being targeted by this administration because they have views that this administration doesn't agree with. We've represented students who've had their visas revoked because of their free speech. And this is just, a little more than 100 days into this administration. But we are showing up and we are leaning into everything that makes up the fabric of the ACLU. And we're also trying to encourage and facilitate individual participation by everyday citizens who want to find a way to stand up for who we are as a country.
Well, it is so important what the ACLU is doing, as well as other legal organizations and individual lawyers like Mark Zaid and folks like that. So please keep doing that good work. It's so critical. Again, the book is Dividing Lines, How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. It is available wherever you get your books. Go buy it. It's a terrific book. And thanks for coming on, and I hope you'll come back and chat with me again.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
All righty. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.